Hello again. This is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give you all our hot takes, our thoughts, our analysis on some of the topics that were discussed during the school board meeting last night. And we also have this time we have a little bit of more information based on what's been going on around all the things that were discussed last night. And we're happy to bring that in and to give y'all our our analysis on it all. So before we get going, Heather, how are you?
Good, thanks. How
Yeah.
are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for asking. So yeah, what stands out to you, Heather, about what we heard last night? We talked about in our shorter video how there was a lot of information shared last night, which was helpful for sure in some instances. But what was your takeaway? What jumped out to you?
I would say for me, this is just my own personal take. Having spent the weekend really thinking about the first round of lottery numbers, the idea of magnet schools, the idea that we were supposed to use magnet schools and interesting programming to attract. I watched an old school board meeting where I watched a white male from just 2010. It's not that old. Really just talking about how we need to either he said we either need to like incentivize white parents to let students of color into their schools, or right, so he kind of used some of those language, but I mean, I think the idea is like magnet schools are designed to create integration. And I think because we spent so long during the CDD process learning about like the idea of moving programming to racially isolated schools, to giving students of color who don't normally have access to those things more direct access, and then just the year that our city has been through. Like this has just been like, a year like many of us have not seen before. I really thought maybe naively that our city was going to live its values more than it did, or more than that first round of lottery um, really showed. And then I just think, as I reflect on sort of some of the comments that I've seen white parents making on media boards and different things about like, well, if my two siblings don't get into this school, I'm out. And, I'm not sending my kid to a school that's going to take years to have academic rigor. And some of those kinds of things where I just feel like, I think, seeing those early lottery numbers kind of grounded me in the reality that like we kind of are still willing to isolate students by race and class, generally speaking, in our city, and to have a lot of white rage about asking white people to consider doing anything else.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially when you just said, um, I'm not going to send my child. When you quoted somebody, you didn't say that. You
I
quoted
didn't say that.
somebody saying, I'm not going to send my child to a school that's going to take years to have academic rigor. Um, I think the question is why? Why would it take years for a school to have any type of academic rigor? And I think the reason is like, are we willing to actually demand what students of color should have been getting in some of these schools for a long time? And are we willing to ask people to make the sacrifices possible? And I think you and I actually yesterday had a really long discussion about how this all should work. Is it that we need to wait for the coalition of white parents to come into a school in order for a school to improve? Or should the school have improved and then let it be an attraction for anybody to come, whether that's white students or you have more black families come back to a school or families of color in general come back to a school? And so I think that is something that I really am. I'm struggling with that tension, right? Because I hear you every time when you say, like, we should have white families that live their values and should be going to these schools. And I hear that. I also think we have to figure out, like, how are we going to give Hall what Hall deserves, regardless of who is there? How are we going to make sure that the students at Hall get the resources necessary and possible that they need? Because we've had lots of interesting conversations about what's going on at Hall. And Hall is supposed to be the STEM magnet. People have said they value STEM, all, whatever. So it should be attracting people now that it has this new programming and all that stuff. But it's not, because we know that we don't provide schools in the communities that Hall exists in to actually be successful. We don't provide them with the resources to be successful. We don't make the requirements necessary of who's going to be in those buildings, to do the things that are necessary for students. Like, we just don't have those expectations because we think it's okay. And
Sorry, I'm signaling to someone upstairs.
okay, sorry. Um, but yeah, we aren't willing to do that work that it takes to actually make sure that Hall, Bethune, City View, Lind, right? Like all these schools, HIA, get the resources that they deserve, and to ensure that they are actually providing the education necessary. And then so it does, yeah. So then the theory of change might be having white parents come in and demand that from the parents that are in the school, because apparently our system only reacts to whiteness. But that shouldn't be the case. That's not how that's not how our district should operate. But right now it is. And so, yeah, I think it's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear what we hear from different buildings and different North Side schools is that they're definitely lacking the resources. Um, and I also know that from what I've observed from fellow Southwest parents, the amount of energy that we're taking up in like going back to school right now, in making, having big feelings or demanding things or talking about white schools getting whiter. There is a sense of acknowledging and of the fact that like we just there's just more power there, and the system will always respond to white families. And so I don't know, like, yeah, I don't know if you I mean, in my humble opinion, it would be amazing if we just like made like Hall should be great for the kids who are there now, right? North High School should be great for the kids who the children who are in those buildings now. And I think that's like one of the other things that I hear is when people are like, "Oh, that's not a good school." And I'm like, there are families and children and teachers and staff in that building now. And the fact that we talk about these schools as if they're invisible, as if we haven't heard about them, as if they're not worthy of even going on a tour of, and I'm just talking to white folks right now, right? That when we do that, like there's just a sense of racism even in that, in the fact that we don't acknowledge. But I mean, yeah, like meeting the needs of communities. I mean, we've seen it, right? We've seen district come back to meetings after meetings after meetings in certain Southwest schools. We've seen it. They demand a meeting. They want someone to show up at their site council. The brass shows up at their site council. I would love to know, from some Northside parents, how often they get certain people from the cabinet to attend their site council meetings.
And so yeah, and so I think that what's frustrating for me is like, and I think this is just a little bit where your theory of change is different than my theory of change, and I think that's okay, right? I think, like, sure, whatever, white parents, you all do your thing. I don't think you need to gentrify our schools necessarily, but like,
Yes.
do your thing. But what should be happening and what should have always happened is that the district looked at our schools and said, yo, we need to do much better. And I think right now with the phase or the space that the district's in is they recognize that families of color are leaving. They recognize that families of color are being disrespected. And so they will provide they will try to provide. I don't want to say they will. They'll try to provide.
They have said they might. They have said they will.
Well, what I'm saying is like they'll try to provide like the one-to-one response to like whatever is going on. So like, oh, you feel disrespected? Let's figure that out. Let's do a climate framework, whatever. But what is not happening is like the systemic approach to what's going on in the school. And so I'd say the climate framework is probably our closest example. But you and I visited outside of the building of Hall, and then we visited outside of the building of Kenwood. And when you look at those playgrounds and to see the differences in like how far the playground is from the building, whether it's a secure facility that you can like understand that this is a school playground and not just a Minneapolis public park, right? Like those things are also important. And to say like, oh, a community needs to demand it or a community needs to whatever, like you wouldn't let that happen at a white school, but you would let that happen in a school like Kemp or like Hall, right? Like, and I think that's where I'm saying I think the district needs to not look at Hall as if all those parents are white to only respond to whiteness. I think the district needs to look at Hall and look at the community that it serves and
That's
say,
right.
these are parents, this is the community, and they deserve and they have the same humanity as the families at Kenwood or at Burroughs or at Armitage. And that's what I don't see happening. And I think we need to figure out, okay, what are we going to do in order to ensure that the community that Hall represents or serves, or HIA or Laney or wherever, right? How are we going to ensure that we pool our resources in order to serve them properly?
Yeah, and I think just too, like my message to fellow white parents is like, how do you stop um sort of how do you pull back and stop taking up so much space and so much demand, right? I mean, I think the district is wrong in that it does not respond to black parents' needs. And like we can see example after example after example. And also, if you look at like personal accountability, like our district plays the biggest game of hot potato avoiding reality that we possibly can, and avoiding our own. But like, I think for me, my message is just like fellow white parents, like, so how are you gonna like show up? How are you gonna show up in your school, in your space, on message boards? How you don't even know how many ways you take up the air out of a room. Um, and how are you gonna fundraise? You know, I mean, I think that the we saw the big brick pillars and the beautiful fence and the amazing playground. I'm sure all those people felt really good about the way that they built their community, rallied around Kenwood to build what they needed, and they're proud of it. It's beautiful. It's welcoming. It's friendly. And then like so so that's great that they got what more of what they needed for their community. But how is that sharing power?
Yeah. I don't know. So yeah, I again, I think it's probably a both and approach, right? Between us, it's not like the extreme of the one another, and I think we both see the utility in both. But yeah, I think that's where I reflect in how are we actually going to we've moved the programming now. It's
Yes.
always
Yeah.
supposed to be the STEM magnet. It's central, right? You should be able to go to it. We see and we've known that families from South Minneapolis were not going to pick it. It was going to be hard. And maybe after a few years we might see some changes as Hall continues to grow, as it gets its capital improvements, all that stuff. But how are we going to ensure that that's actually going to happen? I don't know. I really don't know. One other thing that we wanted to just talk about is around special education. Um, Last night during the school board meeting, if you checked out our shorter video, this was my do better moment. We just did not talk about special education. I don't know what is up with special education and the CDD and how special education is going to change. I don't know if they're having just specific conversations with the special education advisory, the parent advisory committee, or what, but we are not making a public commitment to special education and what's going to change and what's going to improve. And I don't know um, why that's happening. It didn't happen during the CDD process last year. We've been waiting for updates. There was a website that went up. I don't know how many people are aware of that website and understand that website. I don't know what the school board members understand around what's going on with special education. None of them asked a question about it last night. Um, and so, yeah, I'm just not sure how we're going to ensure that we're going to better serve our students that receive special education services. But I do know that we'll sure say we are underfunded in special education. Um, and I think that's the frustrating part is like, yes, you can ask the state to provide more money for special education. We've done it for years. It hasn't happened. We should continue to do it because our students deserve it. And what are you going to do within your responsibility? How are you going to show up for special education students? How are you going to prioritize special education students? But it feels like we just talk about it once a year at least when it comes to our legislative agenda. We heard a presentation about special education and literacy a few months ago, but like this is your big district redesign, and you just did not talk about special education students. You also didn't talk about homeless and highly mobile students. You also haven't talked about contract alternatives. So I don't really know where all of these things fit in, but I think it's worthy of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, we've always said that we think that there's the academics plan was not for us the academic plan that the CDD put forward. We were always like, when are we going to get to that, right? And it kind of feels like with literacy, with special education, with some of these things where we just like have not I just it's like, why are we not talking more openly about, even if we don't have a plan, can we just like say that publicly, like here's what we don't know? Because it's like we know now what we need to be looking for in ninth grade high school numbers, because that was put out publicly. So now we know if enrollment looks different in September, like, hey, wait, that's not what we said we were going to do, right? It gives us a way to measure accountability. If we don't do that with literacy, with special education, with our academics plan, then it's so much harder to hold us accountable. We need we need more transparency.
I mean, we say this all the time. When I say we, not you and I, but like the district will say this. A lot of people say this. You measure what you care about. And last night,
We measure what it's about.
the district shared what they're measuring in terms of how they're going to interpret success or measure success around the CDD. And there was no measurements around special education. How many students are in it? How many students are meeting their goals? How many students have increased access? How are we, positioning it across the city? Positioning programming across the city. Um, and yeah, none of that was talked about. None of that was discussed. And so I I hope that they take an opportunity in the future to talk about special education and the CDD, but they haven't yet, and I think that's really unfortunate.
I agree.
So that is our take on what happened last night during the school board meeting. Thank y'all for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Bye.